Good morning and good evening, everyone, wherever you happen to be joining us for today's webinar. My name is Dilshad, and I'm an energy sector specialist here at Intralink Korea. Previously, I managed overseas renewable energy projects in the solar, wind, and fuel cell spaces at GS Corporation, which is one of the biggest conglomerates in Korea and the largest independent power producer in the country. Today, I'll be speaking about the hydrogen economy of Korea and help you explore commercial opportunities in the Korean hydrogen market. Before I begin the presentation today, I would like to share with you some of the facts about the Korean hydrogen economy. I don't know if you had a chance to read the reports, but if you did, you must have already guessed what these numbers represent. Well, Korea is world's one of the most competitive utility-scale fuel cell power generation markets, and 35% of entire world's utility-scale fuel cell is installed in Korea. Korea is also one of the most dynamic fuel cell electric vehicle markets in the world. And as of 2020, Hyundai Motors supplied more than 10,000 units of fuel cell electric vehicles, which accounts for 60% of the global market. This report was developed by Intralink, and we are an international business development and innovation consultancy specializing in East Asia. We work with technology companies from the UK, EU, North America, Israel, and we help our clients understand the market and identify opportunities and ultimately license, sell, and secure revenues out of the markets of Japan, China, Taiwan, and South Korea. In the Korean office alone, we have worked with dozens of companies in the space of production technology, power generation, process equipment, and coating and others. The most notably, and this is public information, we have recently helped our British client, Ceres Power, sign a series of collaboration, manufacturing, and licensing deals with Doosan Corporation. Now, let me briefly give you an overview of South Korea before we talk about the country's hydrogen market. Korea has a population of 52 million as of 2020, and with 1.2 trillion pounds of GDP, the country is the world's 12th and Asia's 4th largest economy. According to the OECD data, Korea has the highest R&D spending to GDP ratio, and the country ranks 5th globally in terms of ease of doing business of the World Bank. In terms of the economic growth, as this graph indicates, Korea has maintained a relatively strong growth rate for a developed economy of close to 3% in the recent years. And in terms of the energy supply by source, as this graph shows, Korea heavily relies on imported fossil fuels to meet its energy consumption demands. Oil represents 38% of the primary energy consumption, followed by coal and natural gas. However, there is a huge shift underway from the fossil fuel dependence to renewable energy, albeit from a very low base. Despite the huge increase in the rollout of renewable energy projects in Korea, Korea remained the world's 12th largest greenhouse gas emitter in 2019. Korea ratified the Paris Agreement in November 2016, and the government targets to achieve 37% emission reduction below business as usual levels by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. As part of this plan, Korea is looking to build an economy that uses hydrogen as a primary source of energy for power generation and mobility. Okay, so let's start from the hydrogen policies of Korea. First of all, hydrogen economy roadmap is considered as the backbone of the Korean hydrogen industry. Since the announcement of the roadmap in 2019, the government is targeting to roll out the hydrogen economy broadly in 3 stages: early development stage, growth stage, and sustainable hydrogen stages. So here is a summary of the hydrogen economy roadmap that sets out the targets to the years of 2022 and 2040. In the mobility space, the roadmap aims to increase the number of passenger fuel cell vehicles to 79,000 by 2022, up to more than almost 6 million units by 2040. I think this is quite an achievable target if everything goes at the current pace. And this increase will be supported by hydrogen refueling stations, 310 units are targeted to be installed by 2022. I think this is a very ambitious target if we take into, especially if you take into account that there are only 100 hydrogen refueling stations, including the ones at the operational and the construction stages. So the government needs to speed up the rollout of hydrogen refueling stations to meet this target by the end of next year. The ultimate goal for hydrogen refueling stations is 1,200 units installed by 2040. And in the energy space, the roadmap aims to increase massively the installed capacity of both utility scale and residential fuel cells by 2040, up to 15 gigawatts and more than 2 gigawatts respectively. Korea also targets to increase massively the hydrogen production from 130,000 tons per year in 2018 up to almost 500,000 tons per year by 2022 and more than 5 million tons by 2040. And again, I think this is an achievable target as the country has already doubled the size of hydrogen production compared to the 2018 levels. And there are also other two important government policies, which are hydrogen law and Green New Deal. Korean National Assembly passed hydrogen law in February 2020 in order to create a legal framework for the realization of hydrogen economy roadmap. The law regulates hydrogen equipment safety requirements, certification process, and roles and responsibilities of different government agencies. And last but not least, in July 2020, the Korean government announced a Korean New Deal, which is consisted of more than 100 billion pounds of fiscal investment in the digital safety net and green spaces. Green New Deal is the term used to describe the projects aimed at reducing the carbon intensity, and hydrogen plays a key role in this. As this graph indicates, out of 100 billion pounds, 47 billion will go to Green New Deal, and out of that amount, the largest portion, 13 billion, will be used for mobility, green mobility, particularly hydrogen projects. I was talking to a specialist a couple of months ago at the Ministry of Environment, and they said that much of that capital amount will be used to maintain the current subsidies for mobility applications. And from here, let's cover the hydrogen economy sectors one by one. Let's start from the most competitive sector, which is stationary power generation. And here at Interlink, we do a lot of work in this particular area. So let me first explain to you how the renewable energy incentives work in Korea. Korea incentivizes the large-scale renewable energy projects through RPS policy, which stands for Renewable Portfolio Standards. And under the RPS policy, power generators with installed capacity larger than 500 megawatts are obliged to meet an increasing proportion of their power generation from new and renewable energy sources. And by the way, Korea uses the specific term new and renewable because natural gas powered solutions are not considered renewable energy sources. So back to the obligators, there are 22 obligators in Korea, including utility and independent power producers, and they must source at least 7% of their power generation from new and renewable energy source in 2020. This figure increases by 1% each year, up to 10% by 2023. Each megawatt hour of renewable energy produced secures one renewable energy certificate, REC. And in order to secure the REC, the obligators can develop the projects themselves. They can invest in projects developed by third parties. They can sign REC contracts with third parties, or they can buy RECs on spot market. So let's take a look at the fuel cell power generation by application. Here you can see how successful the utility scale fuel cell rollout has been in Korea. In comparison, residential and commercial fuel cells have not been so successful, and they clearly stand in contrast with neighboring Japan's success in these sections of the market. And the reason why Korea has massively rolled out the utility scale fuel cells is because of the larger per footprint power generation capacity of fuel cells compared to other renewable energy solutions such as solar and wind power. And due to the land constraints, this is a very important factor in the case of Korea. Korea also has a manufacturing economy, thus the stable supply of electricity, which comes from fuel cells, is crucial for the economy to run without any disruptions. In terms of the key local players, it includes POSCO Energy, Doosan, SK Engineering and Construction, SK E&C, and S Fuel Cell. There is a growing demand for SOFC and PEM fuel cell solutions due to the fuel flexibility and high efficiency of SOFC and easy startup and shutdown functions of PEM fuel cell technologies. And as you can see in this graph, most of the core technology was sourced from the UK and the US companies. And apart from the Ceres Power that I mentioned earlier in 2017, other local one of the local players, SK E&C, signed a distribution agreement for Bloom Energy's SOFC systems in 2017, and a joint venture agreement in 2020 to manufacture the systems in Korea. And by the way, I don't have this information in this table. Just recently, SK Group announced on the investment up to $1.5 billion in Plug Power. So that indicates that the market is expanding dynamically. And there are a lot of opportunities for the foreign fuel cell solution providers. As I mentioned earlier, fuel cell passenger mobility is one of the most dynamically growing spaces of the Korean hydrogen industry. In the streets of Seoul nowadays, it's not uncommon to see a lot of fuel cell cars. In fact, from January to October 2019, more than half of the commercial fuel cell electric vehicles supplied globally were made in Korea. Particularly, Hyundai Motors has now surpassed Japan's Toyota and Honda to achieve the world's top fuel cell electric vehicle sales. In the domestic market, thanks to the government subsidies, FCEV sales are increasing more rapidly than battery electric vehicles. And in the first quarter of 2020, domestic fuel cell electric vehicle sales increased by more than 455% compared to the same period in 2019. The central and local governments allocate up to 60% end user price of fuel cell vehicles as subsidies. And for example, the starting price of Hyundai's most recent fuel cell model Nexo is about £47,000. And in Seoul, in capital area, consumer pays about £21,000 for the basic Nexo model after the end user subsidies. And apart from the direct end user subsidies, the government also provides further incentives in the form of tax exemption benefits and discounts on public parking spaces and highway tolls. In the fuel cell bus space, currently Hyundai Truck and Bus is the only OEM in the market, and Hyundai's fuel cell electric vehicle bus costs about £407,000, and it receives up to 50% end user subsidy from the local governments, bringing the price down to £2,000 per unit. The hydrogen price at the refueling stations falls within the range of 4.6 and 5.7 pounds per kilogram, including 10% VAT. And you know, there is no ceiling for the price of hydrogen at the refueling stations, except maybe for the refueling stations installed near highways. And it might surprise you, it's fairly cheap. Sometimes it's very hard to make the economics of the projects work out, but it is what it is. And at this price level, we can say that hydrogen is substantially cheaper than petrol, diesel, and LPG on cost per kilometer basis. In the freight mobility space, there have been a lot of development recently, and Hyundai Truck and Bus began mass production of the world's first fuel cell truck. And just recently, earlier this year, the Ministry of Environment announced on the subsidies that the central and local governments combined will subsidize up to £260,000 of the end user price of fuel cell trucks. So that means that the fuel cell truck market is going to expand substantially in the upcoming 2 or 3 years. Korea also has 3,300 islands, and delivering goods to these rural areas has always been challenging to the logistics companies, and fuel cell drones are perhaps one of the potential solutions to this problem. Apart from the last mileage delivery services to these rural areas such as islands, fuel cell drones are also used on military, plant inspection, and agriculture purposes in Korea. The local OEMs such as Doosan Mobility Innovation are known to have fuel cell drones at commercial stage. In terms of the material handling equipment, particularly fuel cell forklifts are currently at the early development stage in Korea, and the lack of refueling stations and high equipment price are the biggest challenges for the wide rollout of this equipment in the country. And this is exactly why big conglomerates such as SK Group are investing billions of dollars in creating both hydrogen production and refueling infrastructure by partnering with the solution providers such as Plug Power. Korea's local forklift OEMs such as Doosan and Hyundai have electrified most of their product line with lithium-ion batteries, and they are increasingly moving towards fuel cells. We are in regular contact with the local port authorities here, and I can tell you that they are moving very quickly towards adoption of fuel cell-based material handling equipment within the port territories. And actually, we have recently closed a deal with one of the OEMs in Korea for one of our clients, and we are expecting a lot to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. In the construction fuels powered construction equipment space, again, Hyundai Construction Equipment is the only OEM that is working on the fuel cell-based construction equipment. They have recently announced on the development of fuel cell excavators in partnership with the other Hyundai Motor Group subsidiaries, Hyundai Motors and Hyundai Mobis. There are no end-user subsidies for fuel cell construction equipment, as these equipment are not commercially available in the market yet. Well, currently there are 48 hydrogen refilling stations, operational hydrogen refilling stations in Korea, and the vast majority of these stations are truck-in stations, whereby hydrogen is trucked, hydrogen is transported through tube trailers from hydrogen suppliers. Refueling stations are largely divided into 2 broad categories: regular stations with 650 kilogram per day, and refueling stations for buses with 1,000 kilogram per day refueling capacity. As I mentioned earlier, hydrogen is quite cheap, and operating hydrogen filling station is not a profitable business in Korea. So almost all hydrogen filling stations in Korea are operated by local municipalities. There are 3 public procurement authorities for hydrogen refilling stations in Korea: Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy, MOTI, and Ministry of Environment and Korea Gas Corporation, KOGAS. So far, we were looking at 650 and 1,000 kilogram per day refilling capacity stations, but MOTI and KOGAS are increasingly moving towards hub and spoke refueling stations with on-site SMRs. And MOTI often conducts bids through technoparks that announce tenders after receiving a budget from the ministry, and the procurement authorities are planning to announce 65 tenders across Korea by 2030. We have been through a few of these tenders on behalf of our clients, and I can tell you it's not an easy process. The pricing and the competition are really tough, and there is an evaluation committee in each of these tenders who have a rigorous technical assessment criteria for the technology. And in terms of the distributed hydrogen production, hydrogen is sourced through byproduct hydrogen, large-scale steam methane reformers, and at a very small scale electrolysis in Korea. Korea ultimately aims to secure hydrogen from renewable energy powered electrolysis, or to ship in hydrogen from, for example, Australia in the long term. However, it is recognized that doing this cheaply, safely, and at a scale is some way off. Meantime, the government has identified that the SMR, steam methane reformers, are the bridging technology until the electrolysis price becomes competitive. On-site SMRs are at the early stage in Korea. Japanese companies such as Osaka Gas and Mitsubishi are well known in the country, except maybe with one exception, these companies do not have an operational track record in the country yet. One of the Hyundai Motor Group's subsidiaries, Hyundai Rotem, has recently licensed Osaka Gas's 650 kilogram per day equipment, and they are targeting regular refueling stations with that product. Korea is clearly behind the international competition in terms of both PEM and alkaline electrolysis competency, although the government and industry see renewable energy powered electrolysis as an important component of the long-term hydrogen production strategy. they don't see this method making a huge contribution, at least to hydrogen refueling stations in the near term. So a very small percentage, less than 1% of hydrogen, is produced through electrolysis at 5 locations across the country. And there are 3 petrochemical complexes in Korea, each centered around a large refinery in Daesan, Yeosu, and Ulsan. About 90% of the local hydrogen production comes from byproduct hydrogen from naphtha cracking process, which is then cleaned and distributed to customers. Around 9% of hydrogen produced through large-scale steam methane reformers installed or constructed on or next to customer sites. Dokyeong is Korea's largest hydrogen supplier, and just like other hydrogen suppliers in the market, Dokyeong sources much of its hydrogen through byproduct gas produced at one of the 3 industrial gas complexes. As you can see in this table, apart from the local players, there are also global gas specialists operating in Korea. Well, the hydrogen handling equipment for mobility, such as compressors, storage tanks, and dispensers, are largely sourced from abroad, from Japan, US, EU, and UK. In the compressor space, ionic liquid and hydraulic piston type compressors were mainly used in the earlier hydrogen filling stations, but diaphragm compressors are being used in the recent hydrogen filling stations due to their cheaper price. The key players in the market includes Hyosung Heavy Industry, Kwangshin, EM Solution, and NEL Korea. The Japanese companies partnering with the local OEMs dominate the hydrogen dispenser market, although a local company called Samchan has recently announced the development of the domestic dispenser. The customers maintain preference for the foreign technology with much stronger track record. And industry experts believe this will continue as the compressors and dispensers account for 20 and 40% of hydrogen filling station downtime. Apart from the tube trailers, hydrogen is also transported through pipes, mainly in and around Ulsan city. And the hydrogen pipeline network is based on a conventional metallic type pipes, which operate at 60 bar pressure, but we identified a lot of growing opportunity, growing demand for large scale, for the low pressure and flexible hydrogen pipelines in the market. And there is a high dependence on the foreign technology when it comes to the hydrogen liquefaction, and most of the research around liquid hydrogen organic carrier LOHC is led by the R&D institutes and public companies. Korea Electric Power company KEPCO is the case in point, who have recently claimed to have developed an LOHC technology that can store 20 norms per hour hydrogen. Despite that, most of the research around LOHC technology remains at the basic R&D stage in Korea. The industrial hydrogen market in Korea is dominated by the established players, and byproduct hydrogen is limited as it is linked to the load capacity of the industrial petrochemical complexes. So the industrial users of hydrogen tend to install large-scale steam methane reformers in order to supply a stable, in order to secure a stable supply of hydrogen. And one of the most common applications of hydrogen, as we know, is fertilizer production through ammonia. And ammonia is largely sourced from abroad, largely imported due to the cheaper price rather than being produced domestically. Other applications of hydrogen, such as for semiconductors and glass manufacturing, are again dominated by the incumbent large-scale hydrogen suppliers. And these areas of the market do not appear to offer easy opportunities to the new entrants unless there is a revolutionary new technology or a business model that is able to deliver much cheaper and reliable hydrogen. Korea is currently not working on the hydrogen blending into natural gas grid. A couple of months ago, I talked with one of the contacts at Korea Gas Corporation, and they said that a natural gas pipeline in Korea can take up no more than 3% of our hydrogen blend. So it's not the major focus of the organization at the moment. So from now on, let's move on to the commercial, to the opportunity section in general. And let's start from the intergovernmental collaboration. And there are plenty of opportunities for intergovernmental collaboration between the UK and Korea. It should be noted that both countries signed an MOU in 2013 in hydrogen and fuel cell spaces, which could be a useful starting point for British companies in this space looking at the Korean market. And there are many opportunities for collaboration between the UK and Korea, such as bilateral collaboration and knowledge sharing between the UK and Korean governments in terms of hydrogen policies, plans, and roadmaps. Collaboration on hydrogen production and infrastructure technologies, and last but not least, bilateral government support for pilot and R&D projects in the UK and Korea. Particularly at the moment, all eyes are on COP26, which will be hosted by the UK later this year, and the British Embassy in Seoul and DIT teams have done an amazing job of promoting this event in Korea. So now let's move on to the commercial opportunities in the market. What we see in the hydrogen production sector, there is an increasing demand for on-site SMRs. And again, as I mentioned, Korea relies on foreign technology when it comes to hydrogen handling and transportation technologies such as hydrogen storage, compressor, and dispensers. As the mobility space expands, we see growing demand for control valves and other general equipment. And in terms of fuel cells, there is a huge interest in licensing fuel cell components, efficient fuel cell stacks, and other fuel cell supporting technologies such as ceramics and coating solutions. And this is the end of my presentation today. I would like to leave you with one thought. Why Korea? Why now? Hydrogen is extremely strategic area in Korea. Korea doesn't want to be dependent on the Japanese when it comes to the core technologies. There is a history, as there is with the British and the French. And so when it comes to the key strategic areas, such as hydrogen, Korea wants to develop these technologies by themselves. Trust me, if your product is just me too, you will find Korea quite tough because they will make it cheaper, they will be faster and probably better or as good as any technology that you have. However, if you think that you have a technology that is different and has some real selling point, Korea is the right market for you. I'll share the presentation material with Yongran, and hopefully you can get a copy for yourself through the webinar website. Let's move on to the Q&A session, and thank you everyone for your attention.